back to this permanent, partless, independent I, which of course no one has an innate sense of that, but we all develop, probably all of us develop it intellectually acquired. So a sense of a self that builds upon our innate sense of an I, something that you can find. It's very difficult to put your finger on it because it doesn't exist, so no surprise. However, like if I were to look for the I long enough, I would find it. That sense of an I. Does that make sense? And build on that innate sense of I, we then make up stories about it. Stories in the sense of like either we ourselves are curious. For instance, if you're like as a young woman, as a young man, you have this thought, oh, what is the I? And you come up with some version that is based on our innate sense, right? Some version of maybe it's somewhere in my chest, or it's a part of my brain, or whatever you come up with. Now, you were not born with that sense of an I. The mind that perceives such an I is not an innate mind. It's usually described as intellectually acquired. We utilize our intellectual capacity, and then based on that, we acquire a view of a self that is like the 3 types of ego that you find in Freud's philosophy. So you just accept that. I mean, Freud came up with it, and then we just accept that. Or the Christian, or the Jewish notion. What is the Jewish notion of a self? Is there a Jewish notion of a self?
Kind of.
Kind of? Ah.
There is some.
What is it? Can you explain it?
I'm not that. I mean, basically, it's a soul.
Ah, so I mean, yeah. So if you had an Orthodox Jew, we could ask. I mean, the one who's gone through the yeshiva and done all the, then.
I think it's same as Christian, right? So
Yeah.
Is it exactly the same? I know that a lot of ideas about heaven and hell, for instance, are not the same in Judaism.
Christianity.
Is it like in Judaism? I understand it's not like the same heaven kind of idea, right? It's more about resurrection and.
I just wanted to say there is a few, how do you say,
Die?
schools in Jewish studies, and one is like the Kabbalah, and I think in the Kabbalah there are similarities like a reincarnation.
Oh, in the Kabbalah they speak of reincarnation?
So,
It's very similar to Buddhism.
but
Pardon?
I'm not so.
No, but they say that there is a soul.
So.
A soul.
But like the idea of there is a mind or something that the person is like desires. There are things that are similar. That's why, by the way, I know few teachers of Buddhism were Jewish, and then they became more religious Jewish. Because things are, of course, there are differences, but like things, there are few like main concepts that
A lot of similarities. I've heard about the Kabbalah. That's I couldn't remember the word the other day. Yeah, the kind of mysterious part of Judaism, they sometimes call it.
it's mysticism.
Pardon?
Madonna was interested.
Yeah, Madonna was very much interested in that, made the Kabbalah very, very famous. But anyway, this is an amazing book I've heard. The little I read about it, I forget now, but I remember thinking, wow. And I also thought there were some similarities. Yeah. But it's not saying they're the same, but no.
Still, there is a God in Judaism. So it's like, this is like a main difference, I think. But again, there are many concepts that.
There are similarities at least, so that's interesting. But the soul, is the soul explained in there?
I think, in a way, yes, because in Judaism there is a soul, basically.
Right, there's a soul.
They don't say that. They don't talk about reincarnation.
Right.
Maybe except Kabbalah. No, they talk about it. Yeah. Maybe only in Kabbalah, but not in the other, like the more tradition. Basically, we have, like in Islam also, they have one life. And they go to heaven or hell.
Yeah, right. That's the same in Christianity, yeah. Anyway, it's interesting. Okay, so it's the notion of self, of notion of soul, and I guess that's probably the closest that you have to this permanent, partless, independent self. Okay. And so we learn about this when we study about philosophy. We first learn about this view of self. So when we study philosophy, in particular when it comes to the self, a lot of time, of course, is invested in understanding the self better. And one of the first things we hear is that there's no permanent partners independent self. That every Buddhist philosopher accepts that. And it's helpful that, like I said, our own sense of the I, if it existed the way it appears to us, it would be permanent, partners, and independent. Although we don't innately feel it exists that way, we could intellectually, of course, based on our background, believe that. But also, if the self existed the way it appears to our mind, it would have to be permanent, partners, independent. Right? It would have to be independent. It would be permanent, and what would its parts be? It wouldn't have any mental and physical parts.
Do the Vaibhashikas not accept that?
No, the Vaibhashikas don't accept that. But there's another type they accept, some of them. I think the Samidhyas, I think they're called. Okay. Then you have a slightly deeper. So this is like the selflessness, the coarsest selflessness. Coarse, oftentimes in Buddhism, if not most of the time, most of the time you could say, if something is described as coarse, then it usually means you can easily understand it, versus the subtler one. Coarse and subtle are often, the terms coarse and subtle are oftentimes used in relation to how difficult is it to recognize. To give you an example, what is coarse anger? My coarse anger, you'll recognize. It's the one that makes me turn red, maybe my face changes, my actions, the way I speak, it all changes. I may move differently if the anger, for instance, causes me to lash out at someone, hit someone. That's pretty obvious. So it's more obvious than the subtle anger. Anger that, like those resentment, I'm just angry, I'm not even aware of it. And externally, I look like very peaceful and compassionate, when inside I'm boiling. So here we distinguish again between coarse and subtle. Similarly, there's a coarse selflessness that is easier understood than the subtler type. So what's the selflessness? The absence of a permanent partner's independent self. That's a coarse level of selflessness. There is no permanent partner's independent self. There is no, that kind of soul doesn't exist. That kind of Atman doesn't exist. That doesn't take that much to understand. Of course, you may still be left with a question, what reincarnates? What moves from one life to the next, if it don't have that self? But what is it that reincarnates from a Buddhist point of view, from one life to the next? What is it?
Cause and effect.
Pardon?
Cause and effect.
No. Cause and effect is not what reincarnates.
The subtle mind.
The very subtle mind. Of course, based on cause and effect and whatever causes we have accumulated in the form of potentials to ripen in the form of experiences, that we carry those tendencies with us as part of the mind. However, it's the subtle mind, the very subtle mind. The very, very subtle mind, the clear light mind of death, as is the term that is usually used. It's the clear light mind of death, the clear light. Yeah. Have you ever heard of like near-death experiences? The tunnel, what it comes after? Clear light. They have that vision of clear light. So apparently when that mind manifests, what appears to you, to your mind, is this clarity. So for a lack of a better word, they call it clear light. Rösel. Rö means kind of light or light rays, but light mainly, and sel means clear. So clear light is a literal translation from the Tibetan. So it's the clear light mind. It's not that the mind is light or clear or anything. It's just that appearance of a warm, bright light. They say like even those who have a near-death experience talk about that bright light, that loving, pure light. This is apparently the appearance. That's what appears. I mean, to a mental consciousness in a dream, all sorts of colors can appear, right, as part of the mental. So I guess you could, although it's not the same, but it's similar, right? So therefore it's called the clear light mind of death. That is the only mind that continues. The mind becomes subtler and subtler and subtler. And when the coarse mind has disappeared, it then it becomes, when it's very subtle, the moment the consciousness leaves the body for good, not just for a moment and to come back, which would be a near-death experience, I haven't died yet, but when it goes for good, then the connection is severed between mind and body and there's no going back. And then that subtle clear light mind then again becomes coarser in the form of the intermediate state that also has a body, and then until the time is ripe when the karma has ripened to be reborn, then you're reborn, and again the subtle, very subtle mind first leaves the intermediate state being, and then as it grows coarser, it enters also the fertilized egg, and that's the moment of birth, or I should say conception, really. In Tibetan they always say birth. Birth, conception is the same word, it's one word. Birth from the womb, birth from like conception, they use the same word. So it can be a little bit misleading. They have a different word for birth, but they don't use it in everyday life. Anyway, so conception, yeah. So it's a very subtle mind. And the question is like, why do people forget? Because all our knowledge lies with the coarse mind. We only use the coarse mind. We cannot control it. We cannot control the subtle mind. The subtle mind only, for us ordinary beings, it only arises at the time of death. While we sleep, then there's a short moment of a mind that is similar. When we fall asleep, there's a moment of mind that is similar to the clear light mind, but it's never the same mind. It's never the same subtlety. Only when you are an advanced meditator can you, through your meditation, make that very subtle mind arise before you die. That's possible. And then utilize it to meditate. But those are the most advanced practitioners you can think of. Yes?
How actually they know this is the process that happens?
How do they know? Okay.
Nobody returned from there. So.
All right, that's a good question. How do people know that happens? Well, because first of all, you can reach, like I said, the subtle clear light mind, you can actually, there are levels of absorptions. Like when we fall asleep, there are levels of absorptions. But the moment we fall unconscious, we are no longer able the next day to say, oh, this happened, that happened, unless you trained your mind. And even forgetting about falling asleep, just even throughout the day, you can practice, even while you're still alive, you can go through the same process, but your consciousness doesn't leave the body, so you can watch these stages. Now the question still remains, how do you know that the same happens at the time of death? Well, because some people who are so advanced, they do remember. I mean, they do remember, they do come back. His Holiness the Dalai Lama, when he was reborn, they say, when when they came to search for him, there was a search group, like a whole group. They didn't know where he was reborn. What happened is that when His Holiness passed away, the 13th Dalai Lama passed away, he was meditating, right? He was meditating in his room. So even after death, for many days, there was no longer any blood circulation, there was no longer any breathing, no longer anything. He was dead. And he sat there for many days in the meditation. And now, of course, the Tibetans were thinking, where is he going to be reborn? They had no clue. But then one day, his head was turned in one direction. His head had turned. I forget, from Lhasa, was it east? Or was it west? I think it was probably, somehow I remember east, but I don't know, I could be wrong. So his head, let's say it was east. So his head had turned towards the east. And one of the pillars I think a star-shaped fungus had grown. So these were also the eastern side. So they were thinking, aha, it could be east. They had no way, like the direction. I needed to know the direction. I didn't know. So they knew usually there are certain hints, but they had to be patient. So there was first, the head was pointing this way suddenly. That was east. There was an eastern fungus on the eastern pillar, but of course it could still be coincidence. But they thought, okay, so maybe it's towards the east of Lhasa, in that direction. But then there's a very sacred lake called Hamulhatso in Tibet. And this is where a special being, maybe similar to Nechum, you could say, lives, is said to reside. And I know someone who's been there, an Italian, I think it was Fabrizio who told us when he went there. Yeah, many years ago, before I even joined the IBD, he told us going there. And the stuff he told us. He said, when you're there, you're not allowed to speak loudly. The moment you speak loudly, a very violent wind starts. So if you make noise, this wind, and everyone goes quiet. So if you don't say anything, it's fine. But the moment he said, like every time we made noise, this wind came. I mean, give me a scientific reason why noise leads to wind. Please, anyone. It's so bizarre. And they had no other experience, but he said there was always this wind. It was so, they were with a group of people, and from the beginning they said, be quiet, there's this wind. And he just said it was incredible. And also Lama Zopa Rinpoche apparently said to them, when you go to Hamulhatso, bring me back the water that liberates sentient beings. And they were like, what? What is that water? And Rinpoche said, just bring me back the water. And they were like, how are we going to bring back the water? It's not the water from the lake, but they were supposed to, that was their only job. Bring me back the water that liberates living beings. I remember that story. And that was it. So they took off for Hamulhatso. They had this experience with the wind. So it was kind of scary. So they kept very quiet and they did their practice. And then there's a monastery apparently nearby, not exactly at the shore, but nearby. And they were spending the night there. And he was so worried about the water that liberates sentient beings. No idea how to get it. No one knew what they were talking about. He speaks Tibetan, so he could understand at least Tibetan. And in the evening time, as it got really late, they were somehow sitting together. And suddenly this guy walks up to him with a flask and says, here's the water that liberates living being. And he went. And when he asked the people from the monastery, who was this guy, no one knew who he was talking about. He said there was no one who didn't know what they were talking about. They described this person, and no one knew who they were. But he had the water that liberates sentient beings. He's like, I don't know, whatever. And took the bottle back to Rinpoche. It's like, wow, this is spooky. And so there are all these stories about this special lake. It's very hard to get there. It's a pristine, clear lake. And they say people have visions in this. So once they knew the direction, there were some very high lama who traveled to this lake, and they spent many days meditating. And then a house appeared in the lake and some letters. I forget the letters. A, Ka, some other letters, the Tibetan letters, I don't remember. And slowly they figured out that could be for Amdo. I hope I remember it correctly. So A is the letter A for Amdo. Ka is okay for Kumbum, because it's near Kumbum. And then possibly Taktse, maybe the word Taktse was the village. So again in Tibetan, the letters that, I think it was like that. But they didn't know. So they were searching and searching and searching and searching and searching the eastern area, and they had these visions, and they were searching and searching. And at some point, they looked everywhere for many months, and then they came to Taktse, to that village. And in their vision, they recognized the house. But the family of His Holiness reports that even days before they arrived, His Holiness, who was 3 years old, had packed his bag and said, I'm going to Lhasa. I'm going to the capital. So they were like, no, you're not going anywhere. You're 3 years old. They didn't know he was the Dalai Lama. They didn't know. Maybe they noticed he was special in some way, but I don't know how far they really noticed. So he kept saying, I'm going to Lhasa. I'm going to go to Lhasa. With his bags readily packed. And so sure enough, one day, a few days after he had said that, the search group arrived. However, they knew that a lot of parents wanted their children to be recognized as the Dalai Lama. Of course. Tibetans are just human beings, and you know, a little bit of status, always welcome. Yeah, right. So they recognized the house as in the lake, but it could just be a mistaken vision. You can't always trust visions, and I don't know what they're... So they decided now they wanted to be able to meet the child, but they pretended they were not a search troop. They just pretended they needed a roof over their head. And they said they were like a whole group with like the main lamas. There were some high lamas and the servants. But the servants and the high lama changed clothes. So that the servants, they usually let into the kitchen. And so they could get to know the children. Whereas the head of the group, they would talk to the father and to the elders in the family. So they wouldn't necessarily meet the child, but they didn't want to give away they were looking for a child. They wanted to just be like some lamas on pilgrimage and pretended, you know, they just needed a roof over their head. And so I had knocked on their door, and it was, I suppose, traditional for them to give them shelter. Okay, so the actual lama, who was part of the search group, the search troop, or whatever you want to call it, they got into the kitchen, and they met a little boy, His Holiness. They met this boy, and in terms of age, that fitted. And he spoke in the Lhasa dialect that no one had taught him. They spoke a different dialect. And so this boy walked up to them, very self-confident, and he walked up to the head lama, and the boy said, "Take me with you." And he said, "I'll take you with me. You tell me who I am." And he said the name of the lama. He knew. He said, "You're the lama, such and such lama." He gave them the name. So His Holiness remembered. And so they were, wow, so we're ready, there's something going on. But they were still careful. It could be someone else, you know, reincarnation of someone else. So they didn't know. But they spent some days there and with this boy, and he was just separate. And he had this memory of things, like he knew things. They asked him things and he knew. And it was really beautiful when then they tested him the way they test lamas. They take things from the previous Dalai Lama, objects that he owned, and more colorful versions of the same object. So, you know, a child usually is attracted to colors. This is true anywhere in the world. Now, if there was some kind of ritual implements, they put the ones from the previous Dalai Lama and a more beautiful, more shiny version. And he always picked the right. He always picked the older one, the one that had been used for many generations. He always picked the right one. But there was one case of a mala. They put two malas next to each other. One belonged to the Lama of the search troop, and one belonged to the previous Dalai Lama. But the little boy took the mala, the wrong one, looked at it and put it back. And then the Lama in the search troop remembered it was given to him by the previous Dalai Lama. It belonged to the previous Dalai Lama. So he took it for a moment. That was the only time he picked the wrong thing. He looked at it, thought for a moment, and put it back, and then chose the one that had been to the end. So it was like a lot of different indications, and there was more than that, like dreams and visions and so forth, I guess. So based on that, they made that decision. And even, you see, they had many candidates. It wasn't just one candidate. There were many boys that were special, and they didn't want to come to a decision too quickly. They had to be very careful, because once you've made a decision, there's probably no going back. And if you have the wrong child, even though there were many great practitioners, and so of course they were reincarnated. So it could have been a reincarnation of a close family member or whatever. So they were super careful. And there were quite a few candidates, and they kept it, because the Chinese had already They had a great influence in that area already. So they hadn't taken over Tibet yet, but they had a great influence, as far as I remember, in that area. And so what happened was there was a Chinese official, and he heard about these different candidates, and he wanted them, so they tried to keep it all secret from everyone and didn't tell which one was their favorite, didn't tell. And so this Chinese man, this Chinese official, invited all the children. He wanted to now test himself. And he gave all of them, he had sweets, and and they grabbed, and only His Holiness took one piece, and I think he shared it with his mother or something. And so based on that, and I suppose based on other ways in which His Holiness behaved, he decided the real Dalai Lama is that one. And he did choose the right one. He said just from his behavior, just of a person who's very disciplined and doesn't behave like a typical child, he chose His Holiness. But anyway, so it was a little difficult to get passage to go to Lhasa. That was difficult apparently at the time, but somehow they made it work and they got free passage to Lhasa because this Chinese governor wasn't maybe too keen on it. I don't remember the whole story. But you see, there was memory. So then His Holiness, of course, I don't know, you see, these things are not openly, it's not like His Holiness walks around, I remember everything, like this is kept secret. These are abilities, usually you freak people out, but we do believe that His Holiness has these memories, for instance. So when he teaches that, and it's also in the texts, I do believe people remember and they're very aware of that, right? They know that. And then if someone has a near-death experience, then even more so. If a meditator has a near-death experience, right, then of course they come back. I'm sure there's also near-death experiences in the past. There were those in the past, people coming back without. I mean, I know in the past, this is actually quite terrible, that people were buried alive. It happened again and again in Germany. You know how they knew? Well, they were dead, no heartbeat, they were dead. Like you can tell someone is dead or not. But they had a near-death experience and they came out of it, but they had already been buried. And when they opened the coffin, there were scratch marks and stuff, and the position of the corpse was different. And someone had tried to get out. Terrible, right? It's really awful. It happened. So then they made a rule to at least keep them for 3 days, right? For a few days, so that this doesn't happen, to be sure. They start to decay and then bury them. I think I heard about these horrible events in Germany. So that means you could also have people who were great meditators, so the great lamas who report back on that, but also people who were great meditators, had a near-death experience, and they had practiced in advance to remain aware as they die. There's this very advanced practice that you can only do if you're highly advanced. You meditate every day on your own death. Every day. There's certain stages that are described, 8 stages, and you visualize them in such a way that when they actually happen, you're aware, you recognize them. And you use your dream, where you go through a similar stage, and you do the same thing. Before you fall asleep, they meditate. When they fall asleep, they're totally aware, and they remain aware, even in their dreams. Yeah? So advanced practitioners, they have so much mindfulness, so much awareness, self-awareness, that they can keep their attentiveness when the subtle mind arises. In our case, our attention is gone. It just happens, and we don't remember. Gal, you wanted to keep, yeah, go ahead.
And also about the process of the birth. Like you describe how the subtle mind?
Yes, the subtle mind enters the fertilized egg.
So this, how anybody can know this is happening? Because
Okay.
nobody can remember this.
Right. Well, His Holiness could possibly be aware of that process because, you see, the lamas, they choose where they're reborn. They choose. How do we know that? I'll tell you why. Now, I'll tell you the story of the previous Karmapa. The previous Karmapa, now it's the 17th Karmapa. The previous Karmapa, the 16th, traditionally what the older Karmapas did was they left a message behind that when it's found, that message is then giving a clue where this person is reborn. Now, you don't know when the message is given, so it's a really complicated process. So what happened was, when the previous Karmapa passed, or before he passed away, there are some blessing, like blessing papers. They have, the Tibetans wear sometimes a square thing around their neck. Don't know whether you noticed, or children. Usually it's stitched in some cloth. And they wear them like this way, or they wear them around their neck. And you don't open them. They contain drawings, like auspicious drawings, or they contain mandalas, whatever it is. They're folded very tightly. There's some thread around, and you never open it. I have one at home, and I never opened it. And you stitch it, and you wear it like a protection. Anyway, so the previous Karmapa gave one of those blessing things that you never open, gave them as like a blessing, put around your neck. And so it was given to him by the 14th Taisitu Rinpoche. His name is Taisitu Rinpoche. He received one of those, and many people did receive them, right? Many people received these things. Anyway, so the Karmapa then one day passed away, and they were wondering, where's that message? Where's the message? How can we find him? And they didn't know for quite a few years. They didn't know. And one day, I think Taisitu Rinpoche had a dream or something, opened that piece of paper. So it was given to him by the previous Karmapa. He knew it was given by him, but usually it doesn't contain anything for you to read. But he opened it, and he said, I'll be reborn in this and this place. My father's name will be such and such. My mother's name will be such and such. I'll be born on that and that day. I will be born. How can I leave behind a letter saying exactly where I'm going to be reborn? But then they knew. They went there, and sure enough, there was a boy by that age, parents' name such and such. He had been born. There's a nomad family in the middle of nowhere. They were a poor family. But there's one thing about the previous Karmapa. There's a connection with crows because of the practice he did, I guess, Mahakala and crows. And the family said when he was very little, they left him unattended in the tent one day. And there was some danger or something, I seem to remember. And there were crows in front of the tent, letting no one inside. So there were always these crows around, like protective, like crows. So the point is, even the Karmapa, he left behind a message. So that shows he chose his rebirth. They chose their rebirth. It's all conscious. They're totally conscious. They know where it's best to be reborn. Usually a poor family. Usually a very poor family. Not always, but many times a poor family that supports their practice, that can let go of their child, right? That are themselves good examples to others. They're always like really good families. And usually, like His Holiness's brothers and sisters, his mother gave birth to 16 children, 15 children, and 6 survived. And at least 3 are Rinpoches. I know of 3. Maybe there are more. I think 3. Yeah, I'm not really sure. Ngāri Rinpoche, then another Rinpoche just passed away, and I think then His Holiness, those 3. But maybe there's another one. And then he had 2 sisters as well. One of them passed away, one is still alive. So the point is, therefore, they usually know about their birth. But even if they don't, they are aware of another person's birth. They know. There are too many stories about His Holiness that those are not coincidence. I told you guys in the break, we were just talking about it. First of all, one story I tell you about this very good friend of mine that I mentioned many times, my friend Chunsum. Many years ago, she was walking towards Dharamshala from McLeodganj, and suddenly His Holiness drove by. She could hear the siren. They're usually like a particular type of siren from afar. She saw all these cars driving towards her, and she was like, oh my God, in the middle of the road. So she bowed a little bit, and she tried to generate positive thoughts, like, His Holiness, may you have a long life. And of course, she was hoping His Holiness would smile at her. There she was totally alone, right? So she was hoping His Holiness would at least look at her. But His Holiness didn't look at her, just slowly drove past. In the back of the car, or in the front of the car, not the driver's seat, but the other side. And she was so disappointed. And she had this thought like, oh, what did I do wrong? Maybe I did something wrong. Oh, now I missed out. Oh, I wish His Holiness had looked at me. And the moment she has this thought, the car stops. His Holiness opens the window and goes, "Tashdile," and looks at her and smiles at her. Okay, could have been coincidence. But then on another occasion, not too long ago, this story, the first story was longer ago, a friend of mine with another monk, they were also good friends, they had a teacher from Australia. Well, he's actually from Tibet, but he was in Australia many years, Geshe Kelsang. Amazing teacher, very popular, very widely known, and great practitioner, most importantly. So His Holiness is very fond of him because he does such amazing work. He's so humble and everything. Now, he had a stroke one day. He had a stroke. He was already elderly. He had a stroke. The point is that now they wanted to let His Holiness know. They felt responsible because they were his students and to let His Holiness know. But they felt, oh, to ask for an audience, that's too much. We wait until His Holiness, when he goes to the temple for teachings or something, we wait and he tell him then. But you're not going to, if His Holiness doesn't look in your direction, go, "Your Holiness, I've got something." This is very difficult. I mean, if you've got something to say to His Holiness, you've seen His Holiness walk inside. There are hundreds, if not thousands of people, and he's looking everywhere. So first of all, to find a spot close enough, but for His Holiness to even look in your direction, you don't know. So this is very unusual. I've had many times, if I was lucky enough to sit there, His Holiness doesn't look at me, you know. It's like my ego is, of course, "Please look at me," but it doesn't happen. But they both made very strong prayers for His Holiness, just saying, this is not for us, this is for His Holiness to know about Geshe Kelsang, it's for our teacher. Very strong prayers, okay? So they got a spot right in the front, and His Holiness walks past them, walks towards them, looks at them and goes, "Yes." Coincidence? I don't know. But there's so many coincidences that I believe His Holiness knows what we're thinking. I believe His Holiness knows exactly what we're thinking. 100%, I have no doubt. There are too many stories like that, where people have short encounters with His Holiness. Look, you remember the guy, Harper Kerkeling, the guy who lost his mother, the comedian? The only thing His Holiness said to him was about his deepest pain about his mother, saying, "It's terrible, it's horrible, I lost my mother, I know what it feels like, I know it's horrible." He could have talked about the weather, he could have talked about whatever. I believe 100%, and there's so many stories like that, that His Holiness is clairvoyant. Now, if he's clairvoyant, if he knows my mind or anyone else's mind, he knows what's happening at the time of birth. He knows the mind of that person. He knows what happens exactly. I have no doubt about it. I really don't have doubt about it. And there's so many stories like that. Either everyone is a great storyteller and they've all decided to give His Holiness the credit for something that didn't happen, or this is too weird, the coincidences. And I've forgotten many stories. There's so many more. And there's a beautiful story. You want to hear a beautiful story? A very sweet story. Many, many years ago, when I first came to Dharamshala, there was a Swiss lady. She traveled by plane one day. From Delhi to Dharamshala, she traveled by plane. And she had a little daughter on her lap, and she got a seat, luckily. And then, as she got into the plane, she sat down, and this elderly monk sat next to her, and they chatted the whole way. And she thought, wow, what a nice person, what a kind person. She wasn't really into Buddhism or anything, but she really liked that monk. You know, and the journey was over, he left, and she had no idea. And then she saw him again in a shop, on a picture. And she asked, "Who's that?" "Oh, that's the Dalai Lama." His Holiness sat next to her. And so many people tried to get on that flight, apparently. I remember Fabrizio tried to get on that flight, but it didn't make it. But she did. And that's how she got into Buddhism. That really nice person who talked to her child and was so kind, it so touched her that she became a Buddhist. An hour and a half drive with His Holiness next to her, and yeah, she was like, wow, she had the greatest audience. You know, an hour and a half audience with His Holiness, that was always very long for an audience. I mean, you don't get an hour and a half, but she was on that plane. I don't know, it's an hour, a little more than an hour. Yes, Ronnie?
I heard that they were already announced about the next Dalai Lama. Is it true?
They did announce this. His Holiness did say, there was the question about will there be a reincarnation or not. His Holiness has always said, if the people want it, there'll be a reincarnation. And if the people want it, if that's the right thing, there will even be a female. It depends on, you know, what people need.
There's a story about a child that the Chinese now got in prison.
No. The Chinese Communist government is so bizarre. As a communist government, they don't believe in religion, but they already said, we will recognize the next Dalai Lama. What? Yeah, so they for them, of course, the next Dalai Lama, there's another Lama who's seen as equally important as the Dalai Lama, or maybe not equally, but there's someone called the Pension Lama, very famous Lama. And oftentimes one Lama is the Lama of the other. So the Pension Lama, for instance, when he passes away, and he's recognized the reincarnation, traditionally in Tibet, when his reincarnation is recognized, then the Dalai Lama, who's still alive, teaches him. Then, when the Dalai Lama passes away and the Pension Lama has become adult, when he's recognized, then the Pension Lama teaches him. So it's like this back and forth. But the previous Pension Lama, when he passed away, he had passed away when the Dalai Lama was already in exile. And his reincarnation was found, and His Holiness, I remember the day he announced it. I was at the teachings. He announced the reincarnation was this boy. And the Chinese government right away kidnapped that boy. He was 5 years old. No one has seen him since that time. His parents...
From India.
Pardon?
From India.
No, from India, in Tibet. He had been born, oh sorry, I should have said that. No, he was born in Tibet. They did some exams, like who's the reincarnation, similar to the Dalai Lama. And the message was sent to His Holiness. There are these candidates. Who do you think it is? His Holiness did some observations and decided it was this particular boy. But the day, Gendun Drup, what's his name? Gendun, I think Gendun Drup, I'm not sure. But the day that was announced, or a day later, the Chinese government, sent soldiers and kidnapped the child to brainwash the child, and it's not been seen since. So now he's adult. He's an adult. He's more than 30 now. This was 35 years ago. He was 5 years then. To have control, because if the Lamas are not controlled, then they don't have the control, because the Lamas have a great standing. So if the next Dalai Lama is in the hands of the Chinese, right? But His Holiness already said, I'm not going to be reborn, so that there's the danger I'd be under the Chinese. Even the Karmapa, the present one who has been recognized by the Dalai Lama, he had house arrest. He was guarded by Chinese soldiers, and he escaped in the middle of the night. He escaped from Tibet. His escape was pretty risky because the Chinese government wanted to control him. So they couldn't really, and he didn't have the same position as His Holiness, still a very high Lama, but not having the political, was not the political leader of Tibet at the time. Incredible, the Chinese government. So the recent announcement His Holiness made was there will be a reincarnation, right? That was officially announced. But as far as I remember, His Holiness also said, but it won't be in China. It won't be, and then pardon? Outside. It would be outside, so it won't be in China, it will be outside of China. And then the Chinese government said, no, the next Dalai Lama, they announced he will be in China. We will recognize him. Oh my God. You guys, you're communists. You don't even believe in religion, and now you want to determine a reincarnation. Yeah, this is a huge thing for them.
But His Holiness very skillfully has said he's going to live till 130, so don't even bother.
Yeah, His Holiness has said he has many visions that he will live up to a very old age. And I think it's actually really weird that people ask His Holiness when he's still alive, And according to his visions, has another 20 years to live, and everyone, so when you're dead, not that His Holiness cares, but it's kind of a little funny that suddenly there's this obsession. And what I find most annoying is that His Holiness has answered all these questions, and they ask again and again about the reincarnation. Every question has been asked, but yeah, anyway, there's something about that right now, I don't know. But yeah, so in answer to your question, or in answer to what you said, yes, Tyler?
He made such an elegant, like cheeky comment too, when the Chinese are obsessing over the Dalai Lama's reincarnation. They don't even believe in religion. It's like, shouldn't they be a little bit more concerned about Mao's reincarnation?
That's true, yeah. What about his reincarnation? Yeah, they're still pretty much, Mao Zedong didn't do much wrong. His picture is still everywhere to be seen. What about his reincarnation? Yeah, someone asked them. But you could probably go to prison if you were to ask them. Okay.
Would you be reincarnated?
Pardon?
Would you be reborn? Your reincarnation.
What?
What about your reincarnation?
Well, maybe I'll be a dog or a cow, or who knows? No idea. All right, so anyway, these are important questions because they really have these abilities, and we all have that potential to have these abilities, and that's why people tell us about it. Anyway, going back to Coarser and subtler, that's how we got to coarse and subtle. I'm sorry, I got a little bit off track again, but in a way, sometimes it's uncontrolled, but sometimes I'm also thinking I want to give you a fuller picture within the cultural context and everything else. So understanding only compassion and emptiness without everything else around doesn't...
It helps.
Pardon?
It helps.
It helps, right? It puts things into context, yes. And also, of course, Buddhism is packed into the whole culture, which understanding more about that is good. Okay, but going back to the subtler, the coarser types of selflessness now. So you have a coarser type I already mentioned, and there's a slightly subtler one. Now watch out. There's going to be a long word. There's one very long phrase. Do you know the phrase?
Well, there are two ways of saying SSES.
Yeah.
Substantially self-existent, substantially self.
A self-sufficient, substantially existent.
Substantially existent self, right?
And the other one? SSSE.
Autonomous self, autonomous, substantial self.
Okay. Oh, some people would say autonomous. Autonomous again?
But see, autonomous is not used, as far as I know, for the first level. Autonomous is used for the second level.
Oh yeah, there are two levels. Okay. I see what he's saying. So yes, there's something that's called a self-sufficient, substantially existent I. Now there are two versions of this, where the self-sufficient refers to self and body, self on one hand, and body and mind being totally separate, as before. But the self being the controller of body and mind, right? Being like a controller, being in charge, being that which is in charge. So like a controller, like an owner. Just in an inherently existent I, when you perceive an inherently existent I, you don't necessarily have to perceive it as an owner, as a controller. I did mention that, but this is actually a coarser version of the I. There's a coarser version. Does that make sense? So again, like out of this story, there's something here. It starts off, the subtlest view of ourselves, the subtlest wrong view that's most difficult to recognize is that there's something there. There's something there that's called the I, right? Something there. Does that make sense? And we can't really put it into words. It's difficult to grasp. That's the subtlest wrong view we have. It's very difficult to really recognize. But a coarser version of that is there's something there and that thing is the owner. That's a little coarser. And then there's something there and that thing is permanent, partners, and independent. See? Yeah? Coarser and coarser and coarser. Usually when we talk about a subtler misconception, you can also give you another example. For instance, holding on to permanence. We believe that phenomena don't exist moment by moment. In other words, we have that innate view that things don't change moment by moment. That's a wrong consciousness. So these moments are tiny, 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 but although they're actually changing all the time, we don't believe that to be true. That's a very subtle view. And it's very difficult to understand that this view is wrong. In other words, to understand that they do change all the time, from moment to moment. But if these moments were made longer, right, then a view that I don't change within 10 years, that's coarser, right? Because it's very obvious to me that I change after 10 years. Okay? So that view, if somehow I were to believe on an emotional level I wasn't changing, like for instance, I'm the same I, I'm the same I. If I were to hold on to I'm that same I was 10 years ago, that view is slightly coarser. It's easier to understand that I've changed within 10 years. I'm not the same person. Versus the fact that I change moment by moment. You see? So there's a coarser version. And the coarsest version is that I won't die. Okay? You have three versions. One version is that I don't change moment by moment. That's a wrong view. Then the second view is that within 10 years, for instance, I won't change. The last one is, or let's say from the moment I'm born until I die, I won't change, right? That's very coarse. Or the coarsest is, I will always be there. I will never die, okay? So you could say these are three views of permanence, where the easiest is that I will die one day. The second is that of course I'll change. And the last one, changing moment by moment, that's the most difficult to eliminate. You see the similarity? Now here, the subtlest view when it comes to the I is, I can find something. There's something there. The subtlest wrong view. Believing if I look for the self, I don't know what the self is, but there's something there.
Is this the mixed one? You don't say it's neither feels separate nor one with, that it's kind of mixed in there. Is that the kind of view?
It's none of those. It's none of those. That would just be the consequence of that. If that existed, it would have to be either this or that. Oh no, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about perceiving inherent existence. Not about the autonomous self-sufficient, no. Just perceiving inherent existence. Perceiving inherent existence. So that is the hardest to understand, that there is no inherent existence. There's nothing within me. In other words, the subtlest view is like, there's something there. That's the I. There's something there, that's the I. Nothing more. No sense of one, nothing further. That is the most difficult to get rid of. You can get rid of all the other views and still be left with that. Okay? All right. The easiest view to eliminate is that there's no permanent, partless, independent self. That you can easily understand. And then there's something in between. There's something in between, which is based on the idea that there is something really there. You come up with a view that there is an I that controls mind and body, like a controller, an inherent I that functions as a controller. Okay? That is the view of a self-sufficient, substantially existent self. Right? And that is subtler than the view of a permanent, partless, independent self. It's subtler than that. So perceiving a permanent, partless, independent self, that view is pretty easily, you can easily overcome that. Then there's the view that there's really something findable, there's an inherent I there. That view is the most difficult. But in between is the view of a self-sufficient, substantially existent I. That is the medium view. Okay, so what does that really mean? Self-sufficient, substantially existent. They mean the same thing. I'll tell you in a moment what self-sufficient means, and then it becomes clear that they have the same meaning. Okay? So, self-sufficient just means that it has some kind of independence. Some kind. Some kind could mean totally independent of mind and body. That's one version. So, as previously we said, self and body and mind are like totally separate. Still, that version on top of that, the I is like a controller. So you have the previous view, but without believing the self to be permanent and partless. That view is gone. So you don't believe the self to be permanent and partless, but you still believe the self to be different from mind and body, right? Different from mind and body, and a controller. So you let go. Partless is not an issue. Okay, it has parts. Plus, it's definitely not permanent. Let's say it's impermanent, but it exists separate from mind and body and is like the controller. That's one version of the self-sufficient, substantially existent I. The second version is that it doesn't exist that independent of mind and body, but it still has some kind of autonomy or like some kind of self-sufficiency. It's kind of still separate and controls mind and body. So these two versions of a self-sufficient, substantially existent I, the two versions of them, one, the self exists totally independent of mind and body, so that leans more towards the first, the permanent, partless, independent self. And the second version leans more towards our innate sense of a self, where we believe self and body and mind are interconnected. But nevertheless, both versions of a self-sufficient, substantially existent I believe in an I that's like a controller, right? Yeah, if I had now it all written out for you and you could at least look at it. For some of you, it may be a little bit overwhelming, all the terminology. But really, just once again, the first type is like a pea in a pot, a pea that never changes. So a permanent, partless, independent self, something like a self you could separate out from mind and body, and that continues on into a new body and mind. Okay, something like the soul, if you like, goes into heaven, whatever. Okay, that's one version. Then there is the version of where it's not permanent, it's not partless, but it exists separate somehow from mind and body, and is like the owner, the user, the utilizer. It owns, it controls mind and body. It's separate from them, either totally separate. One version would be like it's totally separate, or it's separate but still interconnected. Yeah? But in both versions of the self-sufficient I, the idea is that the self controls body and mind. And it's not just labeled, but it's actually there, separate. Interconnected, but separate. Or either not interconnected or interconnected, those two versions, but still separate. And that's also how the self feels. And what is the self, when we say substantially existent, that extra word, it actually means the same as self-sufficient, really, but it has an extra definition. What does substantially existent mean?
It has some substance.
No.
It's dependent, it's reliant, it needs something here.
No. Substantially existent means it's a self that in order to recognize it, you don't need to look at mind or body, right? So it's this idea that the self is self-sufficient. This is just a wrong idea. So in such a way that I could actually know the self without having to know mind and body, which is impossible. Impossible. Like, even if I were to ask you to describe the self, you always describe the body or mind. But it seems that wrong view that we may have, believing in a self-sufficient, substantially existent I, if we have that view, we have the view that it's like a controller of mind and body, but also I could understand that self if I were just to look long enough without needing mind and body. I could. But of course, such a self doesn't exist. But you see, like, our mind can create all sorts of versions of the self based on our subtlest mind, the subtlest version, which is like a mind that perceives, the mind exists, of course, that wrong mind exists. So that wrong mind that wrongly perceives there to be some I, something there, something that can be found. Build on that, we may perceive a self that's a controller. That's not just found, but it's even controlling mind and body. And that exists in such a way that even if you didn't have mind and body, you could recognize what it is. You don't have to rely on mind and body to know what it is. And based on that version, we may come up with a permanent, partless, totally independent I. So you see, that very subtle version of wrong view leads to coarser versions of wrong views. We have many of these. We have many of these, right? I told you, our very subtle view of permanence, thinking that our I doesn't change moment by moment, may lead us to believe that our I doesn't change over 10 years. It's still the same I. And may lead to an even coarser view that the I like that will always be around. In other words, we will never die. It will always be like that, with the same kind of mind and body. There's this instinctive, so from a very subtle mistake, we make also, from there we build up more mistakes, coarser mistakes. Does that make sense? And guess what is easiest to understand? Of the three, permanent, partless, independent self, no permanent, partless, independent self, no self-sufficient, substantially existent self, and no inherent self. What is easiest to understand? The absence of which of those three? So the absence of a permanent, partless, independent self? Is that the easiest? That's the easiest. That is the easiest. There's no permanent, partless, independent self. That is easiest to understand. Then, secondly, that there is no I that is like a separate controller that's in charge, that can be found if we look for it, something that is some kind of boss, some general, something that is like a, I don't know what else, like a commander.
Driver and
A pilot in the plane. That's, you know, my 5 aggregates are that which is controlled. Yeah, whatever, you know, whatever is the view. It feels that way, that the I controls mind and body, but that's just an illusion. When really just the mind controls something, and that mind, we believe that mind to be the I. Yeah. So you see, that's also easier to understand. I mean, that's slightly more difficult than the previous selflessness, the coarsest type. Then there's the medium size, right? That's okay. First, of course, that the I is not totally independent of mind and body. And then that it's, even if it's kind of interconnected with mind and body, but that it doesn't exist, that kind of separate entity, that if you were to look long enough, you could recognize it, you could perceive it without having to perceive mind and body. Without perceiving mind and body, you could perceive it. It's impossible. So you understand that that is impossible. And the hardest to understand is that once you understand there is no permanent, partless, independent I, there's also no self-sufficient, substantially existent I, you may still be left with, oh, but there's something there. There's something there. So something that can be found, some I, not in the form of a controller, not permanent, but something there. That's the highest view. That's the highest view. So the highest philosophical view, they say no, even that doesn't exist. But of all the different Buddhist philosophical systems, only the highest accepts there's no inherent I. All the other ones say you find something. Yes, why? It's very good that they do, because we study all of them, and we feel comfortable. We learn them because pedagogically they're very helpful. The Buddha taught, first of all these philosophies, but he taught some of the lower ones in preparation for the higher ones. You know, like when you go to elementary school, you learn things that are later on no longer right. It's just a technique. Usually I give the one example, when we were little, we learned about our teeth. I remember in elementary school, we learned that we had to brush our teeth. And our teacher taught us why. Because there's something called, what is it called? Caries? Is that what is it called? Plaque? Is plaque eats your teeth? Okay, we call it caries. Oh, okay. Never mind. We called something else. So I don't know. I didn't know the word. But the point is that there's something that eats your teeth. So in actuality, it's the sugar. There are these bacteria, I think it is, and because of the sugar, they can thrive and they eat your teeth. But we watched a we watched a cartoon with these little guys with the jackhammers right? They're like, oh, this person just ate sweet. Now we come in with our jackhammers and we drill a hole. That's how I learned. And in my mind, I was like, I want this guy out of my mouth. This is disgusting. I have these guys with their drills, like jackhammering away at my teeth. So this is how I first learned to brush my teeth, because I was scared of these guys jackhammering away at my teeth. Later on, I learned they didn't look like that. They didn't have jackhammers, and but that's how I was taught, and that was effective for my mind to learn it that way. So similarly, the Buddha introduced selflessness pretty much from the beginning, but it was, for a lot of people, it was too much to take to hear about self. I mean, those were not they were not guys like us. They were incredible philosophers that the Buddha taught. Philosophers such that whatever they heard, they meditated on right away. So we hear it and we go home and forget about it. But here they were like these meditators who had meditated for years. They would sit down and meditate for hours. So if their minds weren't ready to hear about lack of inherent existence, they fall into the extreme of nihilism. They'd be petrified. So the Buddha very skillfully introduced them. First, one view, just introduce them to how the self exists. But don't worry, the world is still objectively out there. So just the self doesn't exist self-sufficiently as some kind of owner. He didn't talk about lack of inherent existence. He talked about impermanence. He talked about other things, right? Not to overwhelm them. Yeah? And because they right away started to meditate, he knew it could potentially be dangerous. So he taught the first school, and then the second, and the third, and the fourth. And until they were ready, it's not like he just cheated them and you got the light version and you were stuck in that and you would never become. No. It was in preparation for something else. And these four schools now, these four philosophical schools, they were collected together and they've become part of the Tibetan curriculum. Understanding, if we learn all of them, they prepare our mind. They make our mind more flexible as we go along, right? Actually, when you study in great detail, you don't hear about emptiness first. It's okay to get a general introduction as you receive here, but if you study it in the detail that we do, our mind is first prepared by learning about the other schools, right? So we get slowly taken closer to the idea that phenomena, okay, in the beginning we're taught that there's this world out there, objectively the way it appears to us. Okay, fine, no problem. Everything blue is blue, beautiful is all out there. That's how we learn it first. So there's not really any discussion on that. But the self doesn't exist as a permanent partless entity or as an owner or control of mind and body. That's all. That's how we start. And then there's impermanence, etc. And then slowly, so we go, actually what's very interesting, we learn first what's called the Satantrika school, basically. And the Vaibhashika is similar. So where there's like this world out there, objective existence, there's an external existence. Mind is important. Yeah, it's important, but there's some emphasis on the mind, but there's still room for improvement. That's how we learn it. And there's this world out there. That's what we first learn. Then, because we're so in that imbalance, external world, not really dependent on the mind, right? Doesn't seem to suggest that the mind plays much of a part. Just a slight introduction, but very, very little. Then we study Chitta Matra, or the view of at least of the Svatantrika that follows Yogacarya. Like it's like Chitta Matra, really. It's nothing out there. We go from nothing out there. Nothing out there, right? We learn that phenomena don't exist externally. So that's like this balancing thing, where you go from one extreme to another extreme. Only mind. There's really only mind. There's nothing out there. We're all dreaming, like the Matrix or what have you, right? Oh, no. This is, again, you don't know the Matrix. Does anyone know the movie Matrix? Oh, you just, Well, some younger people don't. I've met some younger people like, I don't know, this is an old movie. I wasn't even born when the last one came out. So the point is, never mind. So it's this movie about there's this world that's just in your mind, basically. Okay, so we learn about that. And more emphasis on the mind. We let go of this view of this objective world out there. But then we learn about the high school, where it's like there's world out there, but the mind is very essential in that. So we move from an objective world to there's only mind, to there is mind and the external world, but they're very interconnected. So you see how the mind is taken like step by step, and our mind becomes more flexible to think along these lines. Yeah? So to let go of the objective world, understand the importance of the mind, but then let go of the thing that there's only mind, but no, there is a conventional outside world, there is mind. The mind is very important, but they still interact. Very pedagogically skillful way of teaching the highest view without freaking you out. Does that make sense? Yeah, it's quite amazing. That's why we study these different schools. And that's what I taught in Toshita just for 10 days. 10 days. It was 10 days altogether, 11 days maybe. And I taught this, I put together some material, everything I collected, I had learned that I thought was most important for everything else I studied. I put that together, 100 and something pages. And we managed to finish the whole thing in 7 hours every day of class, sometimes a little less, sometimes, yeah, depended. But we managed. Everyone stuck to it, everyone was into it. It was incredible. It was such a pleasure to teach this particular topic, and it was possible to pack it into 10 days. And I don't think, I mean, people said, yeah, some parts I have to listen to again, but we can all learn this. And there are more details that are important, but it's really not that impossible to understand. Yeah. So anyone can learn this. And it's really rewarding because it gives you a good sense, preparing you to move away from our ordinary perception more and more and more and more. So it's a nice way to learn about that, the different tenet systems. Anyway, but the point is here, I didn't really go into the tenet systems as such. There are more differences between them, but they're all in preparation, preparing our mind. You know, like when you go through the different levels, elementary school, and you move on further and further and further, and more you can take on. So here it's similar, for instance, with the self. We went through that as well. No permanent partners, independent self. Okay, I have some sense of that. All right, then there's no self-sufficient, like controller-like self. And then eventually there is no I that exists inherently. Okay, we've spent a lot of time on the no inherently existent I, the emptiness. And it's okay in this kind of course. It doesn't matter that we didn't follow the strict order, because it was hard enough to introduce you to some of the terminology that we need to introduce when it comes to emptiness and compassion. So right from the beginning to bombard you with self-sufficient and permanent partless, I felt that was too much. So to get a sense of understanding at least emptiness to some degree, compassion to some degree, seeing how it can be helpful in everyday life, and then surprise, there's a little bit more difficult kind of weird terminology, but in the end, you're confident enough now that you know from what you learned, however complicated anything else can be, it's still beneficial. I believe you have some foundation, if you didn't already have a foundation, of course. Okay, so that is it for today. I pretty much covered a lot. I mean, we now need to go back a little bit to emptiness again, a little bit more back to compassion, but more it's for the next 2 days. We have two and a half more days left. It's 5 o'clock now. I didn't do a meditation today because I didn't do it in the morning. I thought, okay, I won't do it in the afternoon, but the next 2.5 days we'll do more meditation. Go over everything we learned again, in particular, compassion and emptiness. So you heard a lot about other things as well, but I think I don't need to cover anything more now. Now we go back to compassion, good old compassion. And if there's time left, I may briefly give you a sense how you go from great compassion to bodhicitta, we already did that, and then to enlightenment. Maybe, if there's time, just the different path, but without, I don't need to go through the different path in detail, but just very briefly, how realizing emptiness in combination with certain other minds actually enables us to move all the way up to enlightenment. I can cover that in an hour, to be honest.
So there's a bodhicitta.
Yes.
If bodhicitta arises, does that person become bodhisattva or they're different?
What is the definition of a bodhisattva? Someone who has generated bodhicitta and has not lost that mind. Because it's possible initially you can lose the mind. You can initially, at some point you no longer lose bodhicitta. Pretty much towards the beginning, your bodhicitta is so strong, you can never lose it. So you're on the way to Buddhahood. But in the very beginning, when your bodhicitta is not strong enough, and when in particular someone annoys you greatly and you feel like, I'm going to get enlightened for all sentient beings minus that jerk. And then you lose bodhicitta because it's no longer for the benefit of all sentient beings. So by definition, you lose it. And then you're no longer a bodhisattva. However, it's obvious that it's pretty easy then to go back because already you generated that mind. But yes, the answer to your question is, as long as you have bodhicitta and as long as you don't lose it, you're a bodhisattva unless you become a Buddha. Of course, if you're a Buddha, you're no longer a bodhisattva. So all the way up to when you haven't eliminated the obscurations and you have bodhicitta without, I mean, it's not always actively present, but at least it lies dormant in the form of a potential. It can arise any time again. For as long as that is the case, you are by definition called a bodhisattva. So driven by this incredible love and compassion for sentient beings, all you want is to become enlightened. So as long as you have that wish, you're moving towards it. You just need to want it.
Could you kill a mosquito during that state, or you couldn't do that?
Yes, you can. It's not, well, it's not like, if you go, all right, you're so annoying, for your benefit, I won't be a Buddha. Then you're gone.
Okay.
But if you go, I'll do it for your benefit, but sorry, I'll do it for your benefit. So when you're reborn, hopefully as a human. So of course there's very negative karma, but you haven't given up your aspiration to become a Buddha for the benefit of that mosquito. I think it would be very unlikely that you kill it. That's besides the point, right? I mean, who does that? Who does that? Who wants to benefit all sentient beings? It's almost like, could that really happen? But who knows? All types, all sorts of bodhisattvas, I guess. And maybe due to some, I don't know, some habit of killing mosquitoes, it's possible that they still do it, maybe in the beginning. But they don't lose being a bodhisattva because you need to lose bodhicitta. Yeah. And killing a mosquito doesn't mean you necessarily give up your aspiration to become enlightened for the benefit of all sentient beings. Right? Yeah? That's it. Wait, where's the... Oh, okay, it's fine. Oh, it's 5-2. Okay. All right. Yes, Ashmi?
What is that point until which it can be generated?
Pardon?
What was that point until which bodhicitta can be generated?
Ah, okay. Well, they say, does anyone know? Do you know?
Is it the middle part of this path of accumulation?
Yes, it's the path of accumulation is the first level. You have 4 levels of a bodhisattva, 4 levels of a bodhisattva, and the 5th level you're Buddha, 4 levels. And something great happens on every level. So 4 levels, I can cover those. I can easily tell you what they're all about. So the first level is subdivided into 3 levels, and I won't go into details on them. But during the second level, the second of those, the middling of the path of accumulation, your bodhicitta is described as gold-like. So gold is very sturdy, right? Gold cannot easily be so that's why it's called gold-like, because they say bodhicitta can no longer degenerate. So it's pretty much on the first level on the path of accumulation, it can, on the middling level. The second level that you move on to, it can no longer. So that's pretty soon. after you generate
Is
it.
that because one has a conceptual understanding of emptiness at least?
I don't think because some people realize emptiness before they become bodhisattvas,
Yeah, and some people even after.
and they can still lose bodhicitta. So it's actually encouraged to realize emptiness first. So once you realize emptiness first, you understand that was a wrong mind, you understand it can be removed, you understand that liberation is possible. So you would only, or Buddhahood is possible. Once you know emptiness doesn't exist, you know that the mind that perceives inherent existence is a wrong mind, you know it can be removed, and that makes it possible for enlightenment. And so you know enlightenment is possible. So before you wish to become enlightened, you already know it's possible. Whereas the other version, when you don't realize emptiness first you generate bodhicitta, you believe enlightenment is possible, but you don't know. So knowing something is possible versus believing, which one is more stable? We all know, right? So it is possible to first generate bodhicitta and then think about emptiness. That's totally okay. But it's better to know emptiness before you generate bodhicitta, because then you know emptiness exists, it's possible to realize it, it's possible to remove the root misconception, it's possible to become liberated and a Buddha. And then you want to become a Buddha because you know it's possible. Does that make sense?
Compassion resting on wisdom.
Pardon?
Compassion resting on wisdom.
Compassion resting on wisdom, very important. Compassion, that's a good way to put it. Compassion, usually the word we use is compassion and wisdom joined, conjoined, but resting on is also nice. Although they rest on each other. Although, sometimes.
Is that not the reason you want to realize emptiness?
Yeah, they sometimes say that, yes. They do say that sometimes, so one resting on the other. But there are also ways in which the other rests on, right? Compassion enhances the understanding of emptiness, and emptiness enhances enhances compassion. So they actually assist each other. Yeah. All right, great. Oh my God, either you really understand or you just pretend. But no one looks like they're like super confused and they just want to go home. Is there anyone who feels like, oh no, from your expressions, I kind of get the sense it's clear. Well done. Pardon? It makes sense. It makes sense. Good. As long as it makes sense, then there's already a foundation. And of course, hopefully, if you continue with that, more and more makes sense. So actually, if you just have the framework, everything else is about filling in the details, right? So it's not that difficult. Shubham?
When we talk about emptiness, you mentioned first we negate the self itself, but then we understand that it's all interdependent on things, right? But why don't we understand it from, like, why are we first negating things rather than focusing on, okay, things exist, but then interdependent and nothing exists on its own? Like,
why do we? Okay, so that was also something, Tyler, we had that discussion before. Now, Tyler very soon started talking about dependent arising, and this is similar to you, like why not talk about dependent arising first? We can do that, but as I said before, what happens is we somehow believe in an inherently existent dependent arising. For instance, I had a very good friend, one of my favorite people in the world. He passed away. Raj, he was one of my favorite people. Raj, he was incredible. Raj was 80 or something when I think met him first. He looked like a coolie. He even wore these fake rubber shoes. Have you ever seen the rubber shoes they wear, the coolies wear? They look like proper shoes, but they're all from rubber. Huh? What's a coolie? Oh, it's like one of those porters here. The porters, like they call them coolies, like the people working on the construction sites, you know, like the poorest of poorest workers in India. He always wore these polyester sweatshirts, like just cheapest stuff. And he looked like he was such a practitioner. He was born into a family in Varanasi, and his mom got him a Sanskrit teacher when he was a child. So he was raised in Sanskrit. In Varanasi, so the cultural capital of India, I guess you could say. And he learned a lot of languages. He learned Spanish. He taught himself Greek. He was the ambassador to Sweden for many years. He was the Swedish ambassador, of the Indian ambassador to Sweden. Yeah, very highly educated, very well paid, and he was such a practitioner, such a practitioner. So somehow we met, and he would come and ask me questions about Buddhism. And all his salary he divided among monks and nuns. Every year he would come with a bunch of money and said, here's some money for you. And I said, you need it? And he said, no, I don't need it. I don't need a taxi. I just walk. So all his incredible salary he divided up between monks and nuns. Everywhere someone got, like, you know, a bundle of money. Very, very generous, very kind. And, like, you know, he looked like a coolie. He was so humble. And then he would ask questions with these tiny pieces of paper, and he would write, and he would never wasted paper, never. So, like, he had these notebooks with tiny writings, and sometimes pieces of discarded papers, and he was, like, looking for. And he was in his 80s when he taught himself Tibetan. I swear his Tibetan was really good. He taught himself Tibetan. And when I started my translation of Pramanavartika, he worked with me on that. This is a text that is available in Sanskrit. And he compared the Sanskrit and the Tibetan. And he said the Tibetan translation is incredible. And then I gave him my translation, and he made suggestions. And we went through the text. Unfortunately, he passed away some years ago. I'm still mourning because he was so special. He was such an amazing person. He was such a true practitioner, and he wasn't fake. He just was who he was. And he always asked me the same question about dependent origination. This question was packed differently, but he said if everything is labeled, that was his stumbling block. If everything is labeled, if we all leave this room and there's no one in this room, does this room disappear because no one is labeling? Right? And I tried, and I tried again and and it didn't. He couldn't go past. It was always the same question. So at some point I said, your version of dependent origination is inherent dependent arising. You believe in an inherent dependent arising, which would mean that in that moment when something exists, you must be labeling. Otherwise, it's not enough that you labeled at some time in the past for something to exist now. Yeah, and slowly. With that, he kind of stopped asking the question. So I also asked him to first reflect on non-findability. He never wanted to really think. He never asked questions about things can't be found. What does that mean? It was always about that last part. So I said, don't think about that. Think about the lack of inherent existence, right? So I don't know. Maybe he just thought he was annoying me and he stopped asking. I don't know. I have no idea. Of course, he wasn't annoying me at all. But I thought, oh, this is interesting. And he wasn't the only one asking that. A lot of people started asking that. If things are merely labeled, if you're not labeling, if you don't label the I right now, is there no I? That was always a huge question. And so I thought that's because a sense that there is inherent existence. Yeah? Does that make sense? So that's why I'm thinking maybe we're moving too fast to dependent arising. Dependent arising is kind of like it makes us feel good, it makes sense, it sounds good. But the subtlest level of dependent arising, phenomena being merely labeled on the subtlest level can, and this is important, only be understood after you realized emptiness. You see? So actually you realize emptiness first, that nothing exists inherently, and then you can understand, since it doesn't exist inherently, it's merely labeled. Only then can you understand. I mean, the merely gives it away anyway. It's merely labeled in that it doesn't exist inherently, therefore being labeled without existing inherently. So first you have to understand that it doesn't exist inherently. And it's a bit like that. Let's put it that way. To give you an analogy, if someone talks to you, they tell you a situation, and part of what they say is untrue, part of it is a lie, and part of it is true. What is the best way to understand which part you can accept and which one you cannot? The best is you understand the lie part. Which part is made up? And then what you're left with, you can fully understand what you can trust. So instead of getting confused with like what is true or what is not true, first focus on the lie. Focus on what is unrealistic. Once you understand what's unrealistic, it's much easier to then understand how things really, or what is the actual situation. So the better negate what's extra. That's the kind of idea. I think for our mind, it works best in that way. Does that make sense? Yeah, that's my reason. All right, so it's time to finish here. Let's, of course, take a moment. On page 31, we do the prayer, but the prayer is only secondary to That's beautiful, on the next page. Well, then we can do it another day. Let's take a moment and reflect on whatever non-virtues, whatever virtues, whatever potential, positive potential we have accumulated, may that not get lost. May it not ripen into something insignificant, a positive experience, but rather ripen or become a cause for our own awakening. May one day we be able to generate bodhicitta, become bodhisattvas, and then swiftly go through the 4 levels that then takes us to the enlightened state of a Buddha, so that we are of the greatest benefit to every living being. So with this mental attitude, this state of mind, let's recite the prayer. May the precious bodhicitta arise, if not yet born. When generated, may it never diminish, but increase more and more.
We can do it for emptiness too.
That's right. May the precious mind of emptiness arise, if not yet born. When generated, may it never diminish, but increase more and more. All right, thank you, and see you tomorrow with meditation. So now, more meditation.
Questions?
Pardon?